August 2021. Helicopters lift off a rooftop while desperate crowds chase a cargo plane down the runway. The headlines said it plainly. America had lost a war. Again. But what does that actually mean? Not in slogans, in real life. What happens to the money, the alliances, the rivals, and the people back home when the most powerful military on Earth doesn't win? Here's the surprising part. We've run this experiment before, several times, and every single time, the aftermath followed the same hidden pattern. Today, we're going to follow it, because losing a war is never just a battlefield event. It's a bill that arrives in 4 envelopes. The first is money. Wars are fought with debt, and debt always collects. The second is trust. Allies quietly rerun their math. The third is rivals. The moment you look beatable, the chessboard starts moving. And the fourth is home. The crack that runs through living rooms, not borders. Then, at the end, we'll look at 2 empires that lost the same kind of war. One managed a soft landing. The other was gone within 2 years. Same defeat, opposite endings. And the difference between them is the most important lesson in this video. Exhibit A, Vietnam. America fought there for 2 decades, spent the modern equivalent of $1 trillion, and lost more than 58,000 soldiers. On April 30th, 1975, the last helicopter left the embassy roof as Saigon fell. The images burned into the national memory. But here is what people get wrong. The war didn't end America's power. It ended something more specific. The assumption that American power was automatic. The dollar wobbled. Allies hedged. The Soviet Union smiled and started moving pieces. And at home, the country tore itself in half. Each of those became a chapter in the pattern we're following. And Vietnam wasn't the only entry in the loss column. In the War of 1812, British troops burned the White House itself. Korea ended in 1953 not with victory but a frozen stalemate that still hasn't officially ended. Afghanistan, the longest war in American history, cost 20 years, over $2 trillion, and more than 2,400 American lives. And the Taliban were back in power before the last plane even left Kabul. Yet after every one of these, the United States remained the richest country on Earth. So the obvious question is, if losing wars doesn't destroy a superpower directly, what does it actually do? That's where the 4 envelopes come in. Envelope 1. Money. Wars are unique among government projects. They're paid for almost entirely with borrowed cash, because nobody wants to raise taxes during a crisis. Vietnam was charged to the national credit card, and the bill arrived in the 1970s as brutal, double-digit inflation. The pressure got so bad that in 1971, President Nixon severed the dollar from gold entirely, an event economists called the Nixon shock. Prices soared, savings rotted, gas lines wrapped around blocks. The lesson isn't that war spending causes instant collapse, it's that war debt works like rust. Silent, patient, and structural. You don't notice it until something important stops moving. Now fast forward. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, America's post-9/11 wars cost roughly $8 trillion, and almost none of it was paid for up front. It was borrowed, and the interest keeps compounding. Here's a number that should stop you cold. The United States now spends more on interest payments for past debt than on its entire military budget. Read that again. The empire now pays more for its yesterdays than for its tomorrows. That's the rust from envelope 1, and it's why every new war starts with less room for error than the last one did. But money has a second layer most people never see: the dollar itself. America's real superpower isn't just the military. It's that the whole world trades, lends, and saves in dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. Debts are owed in dollars. That means the United States can borrow cheaper and sanction harder than anyone else on the planet. Economists literally call it the exorbitant privilege. And it's held together by one ingredient: belief. Belief that America is stable, solvent, and strong enough to be the world's bank. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What happens to belief when the world's bank keeps losing wars? History has one very clean answer. Meet the British pound. A century ago, sterling was the dollar of its day, the currency of global trade, backed by the largest empire in history. Then came 2 world wars, fought on credit. Britain won both, and still went effectively bankrupt doing it. The empire was quietly sold off, piece by piece. And in 1956 came the humiliation at Suez, when financial pressure from Washington forced Britain to withdraw its own army. Sterling never recovered its throne. The takeaway is brutal. Reserve currencies don't die on the battlefield. They die in bond markets, slowly, after the bills from wars come due. America knows this story well, because it wrote the ending. Envelope 2. Trust. America's power isn't a solo act. It's a network. Dozens of formal allies and hundreds of military bases in around 80 countries. Those bases aren't just for fighting. They're a promise made concrete. And promises are valuable only when people believe you'll keep them. After Vietnam, that belief cracked. Allies wondered if America had the stomach for long fights, and the phrase Vietnam Syndrome described a superpower afraid of its own shadow. It took 2 decades and the Gulf War in 1991 for Washington to declare the syndrome cured. Trust, it turns out, is rebuilt far more slowly than it is lost. Then Kabul fell, and the world watched it on live television. Within weeks, French leaders were publicly saying Europe needed strategic autonomy. Translation, maybe we can't fully rely on Washington anymore. Across Asia, partners quietly recalculated what an American guarantee is really worth. This matters more than it sounds, because credibility is the cheapest weapon America owns. Deterrence, scaring rivals out of even trying something, costs almost nothing when everyone believes you. Once they doubt you, everything costs more. More troops, more spending, more risk. Losing a war doesn't break the alliance network overnight. It just raises the interest rate on every promise America makes. Envelope 3. Rivals. Superpowers don't need to beat America in a war. They just need America to look beatable. And then they probe. Watch what happened after Saigon fell. The Soviet Union concluded the United States had lost its nerve, and it moved. Angola, Ethiopia, Yemen, Nicaragua. Then in 1979, feeling unbeatable, Moscow invaded Afghanistan itself, the graveyard that would eventually kill the Soviet Empire. Be careful what lessons you take from an enemy's defeat, because hubris is contagious. That story matters twice, once for what the Soviets gained in the 70s, and once for what it cost them in the 80s. Hold that thought. It's our finale. Today, the probing is more subtle. Gray zone tactics, artificial islands, airspace violations, proxy wars, cyber attacks, disinformation. Each one is a small experiment with the same research question. Does Washington still show up? And here's the part strategists whisper about. The real test cases are Ukraine and Taiwan. Every delay in aid, every chaotic withdrawal is data. For Beijing, for Moscow, for Tehran. Not because one lost war proves America is weak, but because patterns tempt gamblers. And in geopolitics, gamblers start the big wars. The most dangerous moment for a superpower isn't defeat itself. It's when rivals decide the defeat means something it might not. Envelope 4. Home. The deepest wounds of a lost war never show up on a map. Vietnam split America into hostile tribes, Protesters and hard hats, hawks and doves, and the phrase credibility gap coined the idea that the government simply lied. Trust in institutions began a decline that never fully reversed. The draft ended in 1973, and the all-volunteer force was born partly because conscription had become politically radioactive. Veterans came home to silence, and sometimes hostility. A lost war exports trauma inward, into families, elections, and the national mood. Empires often survive the foreign damage long before they recover from the domestic kind. Sound familiar? After 2 decades of war, polls show American trust in government near historic lows. The military missed its recruiting goals so badly in 2022 that the Army came up tens of thousands of soldiers short, the worst shortfall of the volunteer era. And notice the paradox. The fewer Americans who serve, the more distant wars become. Easier to start, easier to forget, easier to lose slowly. A superpower can absorb a battlefield defeat. What's harder to absorb is the slow conviction at home that the whole story, the institutions, the flag, the mission, isn't quite believable anymore. Which raises the final question. Does it have to end that way? Time for the twist. 2 empires, same wound. Opposite endings. First, Britain. At its peak, it ruled a quarter of humanity. It won 2 world wars and lost an empire anyway. Suez, 1956, was the moment the mask slipped. Britain invaded Egypt and Washington simply threatened to wreck its currency. London withdrew within days. Yet here's what didn't happen. Collapse. Britain pivoted to finance, diplomacy, NATO, and the special relationship. It traded the empire for influence and stayed one of the richest societies on Earth. The soft landing wasn't luck. It was institutions people still trusted, an economy that still worked, and a country that lost the empire without losing itself. Now, the Soviet Union. In 1979, it rolled into Afghanistan certain of victory. 10 years and 15,000 dead soldiers later, it limped out. And within 2 years of that withdrawal, the USSR itself ceased to exist. Not because of the war alone, because the war exposed everything. An economy that couldn't compete, shelves that were empty, an ideology nobody believed, and debts stapled together with force. Afghanistan was the trigger, not the cause, the crack that made the whole rotten structure visible. Britain lost a war and had a soft landing. The Soviets lost one and had no floor. The difference wasn't the battlefield. It was what the war revealed underneath. So here's the scoreboard. The 5 things that decide whether a lost war is a stumble or the beginning of the end. 1. Debt. How much rust is already in the machine? 2. Allies. Whether your network is an asset or a liability. 3. The economy. Can it actually outproduce rivals, not just outspend them? 4. Cohesion. Whether defeat unites the country or accelerates its tribes. And 5. The one nobody can measure and everyone senses. Belief. The story a nation tells itself about what it is. Score those 5 and you get endings as different as London's and Moscow's. Which brings us back to the original question. So what happens if America loses a war? History's honest answer? The country survives. It always has. But the bill always arrives. In money that rusts the future. In trust that reprices every promise. In rivals who start reaching for pieces. And at home, where the real battle is for belief. The pattern behind every collapse, Rome, the Ottomans, the Soviets, never starts with a lost battle. It starts when a nation stops believing in its own comeback. America has lost wars before and come back stronger. The open question, the one being decided right now, is whether it still knows how. If this video changed how you see the news, subscribe, because the pattern is still unfolding, and we're following it.